I was at a neighborhood park recently, and I saw this scene that, I don't know, it felt less like kids playing and more like a corporate HR mediation.
Oh, I think I know where this is going.
Yeah, so two little boys, maybe 6 years old, get into this minor shoving match over a plastic dump truck. I mean, it's the kind of standard low-stakes friction that's happened in sandboxes for, thousands of years. But the reaction from one of the parents was almost surgical. This mother, she didn't just tell him to knock it off or share. Instead, she rushes in with this look of genuine panic.
Panic.
Total panic. She immediately kneels down to their eye level, and her voice is trembling with this strange clinical softness. She starts asking her son if the interaction made him feel unsafe and if he needed to hold space for his big feelings.
Wow. Not a mother, but a therapist.
Exactly. She was acting like a court-appointed grievance counselor. But what was really fascinating was the fear in her eyes. She looked terrified.
Terrified of what? The other kid?
No, not that her child would get hurt. She seemed terrified that she, as a parent, would make a technical error. Like, one wrong move in this sandbox dispute would permanently damage his psyche or fail some invisible metric of emotional optimization.
Well, the kid just wants the truck back.
The kid just looked confused. He wanted the truck. She was treating a scuffle like a complex psychiatric crisis. And that moment, for me, it just perfectly encapsulated the silent siege that's happening in living rooms all over the West.
A silent siege. That's a powerful way to put it.
We've convinced modern parents that raising a child is this engineering problem that's way too complex for amateurs. It requires constant intervention from what some have called the therapeutic state.
Right.
We haven't just medicalized childhood. We've turned the family into a regulated industry.
Right.
And the parent is no longer the sovereign authority, but just a terrified middle manager executing the orders of experts. So our mission today is a deep dive into that very claim. The idea that modern parenting is treated like an engineering problem, requiring this constant, high-stakes intervention. We're going to explore the historical and cultural consequences of this shifts away from family sovereignty, really dig into the intellectual roots of what happened to the family unit, and then look globally to see what this pursuit of guaranteed safety has cost us in terms of resilience.
And that opening anecdote, it just sets the perfect stage. Because what you're describing, it isn't just a parenting trend. This is a deep, decades-long sociological and historical erosion.
It didn't just happen.
No, it didn't happen by accident.
Yeah.
There were powerful forces that systematically sought to dismantle family autonomy. This allowed external institutions, the state, the so-called helping professions, the culture of therapy, to medicalize experiences that were once just considered normal, if sometimes difficult, parts of growing up. To really get the consequences, we have to unpack the forces that did that.
Okay, let's unpack it. I think we have to start with the foundational work of social critics like Christopher Lasch. He argued that the family was historically a little commonwealth besieged. What did he mean by little commonwealth? What was its function?
That term, little commonwealth, is so crucial. It elevates the family far beyond just a domestic group. Historically, it was seen as this autonomous, self-governing entity. It was a moral school, it was a fortress against the outside world, and it was the primary place where socialization happened.
So it did everything.
It did everything essential. Its function was truly profound. The family was tasked with reproducing cultural patterns in the individual, basically ensuring that tradition and values continued.
Just think about the weight of that responsibility. You're not just teaching skills, you're instilling modes of thought, character traits, ethics, things that become habitual.
Exactly. And because the parents were the source of both, immense love and also necessary discipline, the lessons learned inside that family unit were unforgettable. They deeply embedded the culture into a child's personality.
So it's not about outsourcing reading and writing. It's about creating a character that spontaneously aligns with what society needs.
Yeah.
You're making the individual want to do what is required of him.
Precisely. And this delicate, incredibly complex task, it was entrusted to the vertical transmission of wisdom. Meaning knowledge and character were passed organically from grandparent to parent to child. It was steeped in local tradition, in family lore. The erosion began the moment that inherited organic wisdom started to be discounted.
And it was replaced.
It was replaced by knowledge dispensed horizontally. So moving from the expert to the client, and that shift from tradition to credentialed professional advice, that was the beginning of the end for family autonomy. The parent, once the ultimate authority, became just a channel for outside instruction.
And as soon as parents started questioning their own capacity, their own tradition, they naturally turned outward. They opened the gates.
Yeah.
And Lash saw that this gap was filled very quickly by the helping professions. This was his invasion of the experts.
Indeed. This invasion by, educators, psychiatrists, social workers, it didn't happen overnight, but it really solidified between, say, 1900 and 1930.
And how did they justify it? How did they justify taking over these parental functions?
They used the analogy of preventative medicine. They essentially framed society, and especially the family, as a sick patient. And this patient required a broad delegation of medical authority in order to be healed.
That reframing is everything.
It signaled a profound realignment of what society values. Lash articulated this so well through the change in society's symbolic center. In early modern times, the church or cathedral was at the core.
Right, the moral center.
Then, by the 19th century, that focus shifted to the legislative hall, the place for public decisions. But in our time, the symbolic center has become the hospital. The hospital. And that marks the definitive medicalization of society. Deviancy isn't sin anymore. It's not even a crime. It's framed as a sickness that requires therapeutic intervention.
Wow, that progression from church to legislative hall to hospital. That's a really powerful historical marker. But I have to ask, while Lash is critiquing this usurpation of authority, wasn't there also a legitimate public health crisis happening at the turn of the century? I mean, especially in urban and immigrant communities. You had devastating infant mortality, sanitation problems, unsafe factories. So how do historians separate the state's genuine need to intervene for public health from this other unstated goal of assimilation?
That is a crucial distinction, and the reality is both forces were absolutely at play at the same time. There were legitimate public health emergencies that demanded state-level action. No one disputes that.
Okay.
However, historians note that these genuine crises were often, they were leveraged by reformers who had much broader sociological agendas.
So they used the crisis.
They used the crisis. The sources suggest that policymakers and these progressive-era reformers, they explicitly saw the traditional autonomous family, especially immigrant families clinging to their own language and traditions, as an obstacle. An obstacle to social progress.
And they defined progress as what?
As homogenization and Americanization. So the mechanism of invasion was dual purpose. You address a real sanitary problem, but in doing so, you remove children from that deep familial influence, and you place them under the, quote, benign influence of the state and the standardized school system. The goal was deliberate. Dismantle that localized fortress of culture.
So the argument was that the private family maintained too much cultural difference. The state needed a compliant, homogeneous population, and public health was the perfect humanitarian-sounding disguise for this cultural dismantling.
Precisely. And this invasion was solidified by a genius bit of sociological engineering, the self-fulfilling prophecy. This is maybe the most insidious part of the whole process.
How did that work?
By persuading parents, especially mothers, to rely heavily on outside technology, on specialized products, on the continuous advice of certified experts for nutrition, for hygiene, for anything, the core capacity of the family to provide for itself began to atrophy. It just withered away.
They intentionally and systematically stripped the family of its everyday confidence. They told parents they needed complex outside tools and knowledge to succeed.
Exactly. They diffused this ideology of social welfare, the idea that specialized knowledge external to the family was essential. And they convinced the individual to surrender their own technical skills, including the most fundamental skill of all, child rearing.
And as the family's self-reliance withered away,
that vacuum conveniently justified the continued expanding need for more health, education, and welfare services. They created the crisis of confidence, and then they rushed in to manage the chaos they'd helped create.
Which brings us directly to the crisis of confidence we see today, where a parent's judgment is now secondary to state-mandated safety protocols. The story you mentioned of Sarah in Ohio, it perfectly illustrates this new reality of the breached Commonwealth.
That case is such a painful example of how deeply entrenched this regulatory consensus has become. I mean, Sarah simply allowed her 8-year-old son to walk 3 blocks to the park.
An activity that basically defined childhood for an entire generation.
And the immediate result wasn't a neighbor waving hello, it was state intervention. A neighbor called 911 and the police showed up and issued a warning for child neglect.
And let's be clear, this wasn't about a genuine threat. The child was perfectly safe. This was about Sarah battling a modern regulatory environment that sees an unaccompanied child, a child showing functional independence as immediate evidence of parental failure.
It's a codified social consensus. The system has decided that parental judgment is routinely overridden by a standardized zero-risk safety protocol. Risk has been redefined so aggressively that it has effectively outlawed the very low-stakes experiences that build confidence and self-reliance in kids.
The moment that police cruiser pulled into her driveway, the whole concept of the family as a sovereign moral school was just gone. It was replaced by the reality of the family as a unit under constant surveillance.
And Sarah was no longer the ruler of her home. She was a nervous middle manager subject to a community audit.
Think about the chilling effect that has. It doesn't just impact that one family. It sends a clear message to all parents. Your own judgment is not enough. You have to adhere to the external, expert-driven standards of care, or you risk losing your children. And it shows the extent to which the state, operating through your neighbor as an auditor, has definitively entered the private sphere.
Right. The walls of the Commonwealth have been breached.
So if that's the historical erosion that paved the way for the therapeutic state, what are the long-term costs, psychologically, societally? Lash was so insightful here, tying the decline of family sovereignty directly to what he called the culture of narcissism.
Yes, but we have to be very careful with his definition of narcissism. It goes way beyond the simple colloquial meaning of someone who's just vain or self-absorbed.
The deeper pathology.
A much deeper pathology. He saw it as born out of the shift in American culture after the political disappointments of the 60s. When people gave up hope of improving society through collective political action, they retreated. They turned inward.
Right. They convinced themselves the only meaningful battle was internal.
Exactly. It became all about psychic self-improvement, getting in touch with your feelings, jogging, refining your personal relationships. This intense personal preoccupation was the foundation for a deeply narcissistic culture. It's not just self-love. It's a profound dependence on external validation.
So the individual turns inward, but it doesn't lead to genuine inner strength. It's the opposite. They need validation from a world they feel powerless to actually shape.
Precisely. The psychological core of Lash's narcissism is this reliance on others to validate your very sense of self-esteem. The narcissist can't tolerate being alone. They need an admiring audience.
The world becomes a mirror.
The world becomes a mirror, just reflecting the desired image of the grandiose self. The old image of the rugged individualist shaping an empty wilderness is replaced by the anxious, dependent individual constantly checking their reflection in the eyes of others.
And this dependency lines up perfectly with that erosion of competence we were just talking about. If I outsource the core functions of my life, raising my kids, managing my health to experts, I become fundamentally dependent on that bureaucracy.
It's the inevitable result, that atrophy of competence. Lash saw that when people surrender their skills to corporations and experts, their everyday ability to cope just diminishes. And the psychological outcome is deeply troubling.
Which is?
A generation that enters adulthood, as he noted, fragile, risk-averse, and dependent on authority figures to mediate their conflicts. They lack the internal resources to handle friction because they were never given the chance to develop them independently. They are primed for perpetual dependency on the therapeutic state.
And this culture of fragility is then massively reinforced when the therapeutic state partners with institutions like, say, the education system. It creates a standardized environment that pathologizes anything outside the norm. This is the pathologizing feedback loop. And the story of Leo in the UK is a perfect illustration.
The case of Leo, it really highlights the systemic costs of this approach. So Leo was a high-energy 10-year-old. Probably bright, but, disruptive in a very rigid classroom setting.
Historically, a different system might have adapted to him.
Right. A system sensitive to different learning styles might have put him on a vocational track, or increased recess time, or offered alternatives to just sitting still for 7 hours a day.
But the anecdote shows the administration completely bypassed environmental adaptation. They went straight to suggesting medical intervention.
And that is the chilling mechanism of the feedback loop. The standardized, metric-driven environment demands that the child be chemically altered to fit the environment, rather than adapting the environment to fit the child's needs.
So the system defines this very narrow, acceptable band of compliant behavior.
And everything outside that band is immediately medicalized. It's labeled as a disorder requiring pharmacological intervention, like ADHD medication.
This is so much bigger than just a behavioral issue. It has enormous long-term economic and societal implications. We're literally talking about the cost of actively flattening neurodiversity.
Absolutely. When you medicate or cap the very behaviors that, in a slightly different context, might lead to incredible creativity or entrepreneurial drive or vital non-standard thinking, you're incurring a massive societal expense.
And that cost goes way beyond just healthcare dollars for medication.
Oh, far beyond.
Yeah.
You are potentially capping national productivity by flattening these diverse neurotypes into a compliant, manageable average. We're sacrificing the potential for friction, for disruption, for the innovation that comes from non-standard thinkers, all for the sake of guaranteed standardization and ease of bureaucratic management. We're choosing predictability over potential.
Now, to be intellectually rigorous here, we have to balance Lasch's critique of the state with the very powerful counterargument from public policy experts, especially around the social determinants of health, or SDOH.
Yes, and this is where the tension truly lies. The SDOH framework argues for external intervention precisely because the family unit is not always an autonomous fortress that's capable of shielding kids from systemic failure.
Okay.
So policymakers focused on SDOH, they view the environment, things like housing instability, food insecurity, economic stress, neighborhood violence, as non-clinical factors that shape a child's well-being from the very earliest stages of life.
And their argument is powerful because they can show that these disparities disproportionately affect marginalized and low-income communities. They create these intergenerational consequences that no amount of internal family strength can overcome on its own.
Precisely. If a pregnant mother is experiencing chronic toxic stress because of housing insecurity, that stress directly affects the baby's fetal brain development. So the SDOH perspective says public investment is essential for holistic policymaking.
And they advocate for multi-generational intervention.
Exactly. Programs that activate parenting skills alongside providing that crucial infrastructure support. The goal is to maximize social mobility. They don't see intervention as an intrusion, they see it as essential support.
So we have this fundamental conflict, Lasch is saying. External intervention destroys family autonomy and creates chronic dependence. And the SDOH policy view is arguing, without systemic external intervention, especially against these huge environmental inequities, the family is structurally incapable of ensuring healthy outcomes. It's a dilemma of sovereignty versus stability.
It forces us to ask a really hard question. If a family needs help, how should the state provide it? We can model it for you. Option A. The state provides cash, housing vouchers, resources directly, and trusts the family as a sovereign unit to allocate them. This minimizes external control.
It prioritizes sovereignty.
Right. Option B. The state provides specialized services delivered by certified state professionals, social workers, therapists, mandated classes. This increases state control and surveillance.
Prioritizing stability and compliance. So which approach does the research suggest minimizes the risk of creating that terrified middle manager parent we started with?
Well, that's the open question that policymakers are really struggling with. Many SDOH policies, like the nurse-family partnership model, try to blend both. They have home visiting nurses who work with first-time, often low-income mothers. They focus on building parenting skills while also connecting them with resources.
So they're trying to activate the parent's existing competence.
They are, while also alleviating that systemic stress. But critics still argue that even the most well-intentioned programs carry this inherent risk of creating dependency and standardizing behavior. Potentially substituting the wisdom of the professional for the wisdom of the parent. The core tension is still there. How do you get necessary stability without destroying essential sovereignty?
The argument from the therapeutic state is always that constant safety and optimization lead to the best outcomes. But to test that, we really need to look outside of Western culture. Let's start with this visible fragility gap that our pursuit of zero risk has created.
The contrast can be just astonishing to people raised in these hyper-regulated Western environments. I mean, you think about the 6-year-old Japanese girl navigating the subway alone to get to school.
A scene that would trigger 911 calls across North America.
Instantly. But there, it's a functional independence built right into the cultural fabric. It's an expected developmental milestone that promotes self-reliance.
And you contrast that with the universal image of American parents, gridlocked in a massive car line, dropping off teenagers at the high school door. Teenagers who are legally old enough to drive themselves. The fear around independence is it's palpable.
And this fear is often viewed with total confusion by people who immigrate from cultures where resilience is forged through necessity. You mentioned the perspective of the grandmother from Vietnam.
Right. For her, the Western approach of protecting children from every physical or emotional scrape, it wasn't a sign of some advanced civilization. She saw it as actively disabling the child.
She was worried that by removing all friction and coddling them, the culture was creating children who would shatter under the slightest pressure.
Which points to this massive philosophical gulf. Our culture defines good parenting as minimizing trauma. Others define it as equipping the child to handle the trauma that is inevitable.
And this philosophical difference, it's actually supported by hard data. We have these compelling results from a cross-cultural study that looked at resilience and post-traumatic growth, or PTG, after experiences of child maltreatment, CM, across 4 really diverse cultures: Cameroon, Canada, Germany, and Japan.
And this study delivers a critical paradox that just challenges the core assumptions of the therapeutic state.
It really does. So the study measured 2 key outcomes: resilience, which is the ability to bounce back from adversity, and PTG, which is the positive psychological change that can happen after a struggle with trauma. And the results highlighted what they call the paradox of Cameroon.
Which was the result that defies all our high-income Western assumptions.
Totally. Despite reporting high levels of CM experiences and living in environments that are often characterized by harsh living conditions, a daily struggle for survival, the participants from Cameroon showed significantly higher levels of both PTG and resilience compared to the high-income countries.
That is profoundly counterintuitive to the entire Western therapeutic narrative. The data seems to suggest that being regularly exposed to and overcoming hardship may actually activate and maintain a higher baseline of psychological resilience.
It strongly suggests that resilience may not be some innate quality you're born with. It might be a resource that is activated and strengthened by consistent environmental demands. When trauma is defined and addressed in an environment where struggle is the baseline, the ability to adapt and find growth to transform suffering, it appears to be significantly higher.
It reinforces that idea that true capability is forged by confronting and overcoming friction, not by its absence.
Right.
What about the cultural contrast at the other end of the spectrum? What did the study find with the Japanese participants?
The Japanese contrast is just as telling. Japanese participants had significantly lower resilience scores. And researchers suggested a few possible cultural explanations for this. One is a lower self-serving bias. They may be less inclined to strongly affirm positive words about themselves or their coping abilities, which could be rooted in cultural norms that really value humility.
Okay.
And also, Japanese culture may suppress what's called high arousal positive affect. They value calm and quiet more than excitement or enthusiasm. So if your resilience test measures resilience, in part by these high-energy positive coping statements, a culture that values internal calm might score lower, regardless of their actual ability to cope.
So even the act of measuring resilience can be culturally skewed toward a Western ideal of emotional expressiveness and high self-affirmation.
Exactly. The findings just emphasize that positive changes after child maltreatment are highly variable across cultures. They're deeply influenced by these ingrained cultural beliefs about emotion, about self-perception, and about appropriate behavior.
Let's move into the specific trauma outcomes. Were there any universal demographic factors that consistently correlated with resilience across all 4 of those cultures?
Yes, the study found 2. Self-reported male gender and age were both positively associated with resilience across Cameroon, Canada, Germany, and Japan.
Interesting.
Yeah. This could suggest biological differences in stress response, or it might just reflect that men across these diverse cultures are more likely to perceive themselves as capable of handling stressful situations. And the positive link with age suggests that the more time that's passed since the traumatic event, the more time there is for processing and integration, which increases resilience scores.
Okay, now let's talk about the damage. Which experiences were consistently and negatively associated with the ability to bounce back?
Both physical abuse and emotional maltreatment were significantly and negatively associated with resilience across all 4 countries. This really validates the deep, widespread damage that these specific types of CM inflict on an individual's core sense of safety and their ability to recover.
But here's the major insight, the PTG paradox. While emotional maltreatment was negatively linked to resilience, it was significantly associated with higher scores in post-traumatic growth. We have to unpack that.
Yeah.
Why would a deleterious experience like emotional maltreatment be a stronger vehicle for growth than, say, physical abuse?
This finding is the goldmine for understanding human adaptation. So to explain it, we first need to define what PTG is. It involves finding positive psychological changes, typically in 5 core areas.
Okay.
Increased appreciation for life, changed relationships with others, so becoming closer or more compassionate, identifying new possibilities for your life, increased personal strength, and spiritual change or a greater existential understanding.
Right.
The hypothesis is that emotional maltreatment, unlike physical abuse, often involves this prolonged, complex interpersonal betrayal. It attacks the victim's sense of self-worth and their sense of reality.
It's a deeper wound.
It's a deeper, more complex wound. So processing that kind of trauma, making sense of why a loved one systematically undermined or controlled you, it requires immense cognitive and emotional reframing. The victim has to actively search for meaning, challenge core beliefs about themselves and the world, and construct a whole new narrative where they are the agent of their own recovery.
And that intense meaning-making effort is what drives the growth.
That's what drives the transformative change, resulting in higher self-reported growth across those PTG domains. Physical abuse, while it's devastating, is often more direct. It may not require the same depth of cognitive restructuring to process.
So emotional pain, because it forces this huge existential reckoning, is a more powerful catalyst for growth than physical trauma, which might just lead to hypervigilance instead of transformation.
That is the profound implication. The growth doesn't come from the trauma itself. It comes from the immense mental labor required to synthesize the trauma and find meaning in it. It's a powerful testament to the human capacity to transform suffering, a concept that's largely ignored by the therapeutic state, which prefers immediate, standardized remediation.
And finally, the study looked at the impact of social norms. Did the community's perception of abuse, how acceptable it was considered, matter more than the actual exposure to trauma?
They looked at acceptability scores, measuring how acceptable CM was perceived to be in the community. And interestingly, in the final statistical models, these acceptability scores were not significantly associated with resilience or PTG.
Only the actual experience mattered.
Only the actual experience and severity of the maltreatment were influential. This suggests that while social norms are really important for prevention and for reporting, the subjective perception of those norms may be less influential on an individual's long-term positive psychological outcomes than the objective reality and severity of the actual traumatic exposure.
Okay, let's shift now from measuring resilience to the active global challenge of fostering it. We have to acknowledge the immense scale here. The World Health Organization reported that approximately 14% of adolescents aged 10 to 19 are affected by mental health disorders globally.
That figure demands a global response. But we face a major challenge. The vast majority of our effective psychological treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, personal therapy, IPT, they're all developed in Western affluent settings.
And their content, their delivery, it's all deeply shaped by that specific cultural environment, which leads to massive problems when you try to export them.
It does. Simply translating a CBT manual into, say, Swahili is fundamentally insufficient because the underlying assumptions of the therapy itself are rooted in a Western worldview.
Right. Simple translation fails to make it accessible or engaging for people with vastly different cultural reference points. The manual's full of Western metaphors, concepts like individual agency, delivery modes that might not resonate or might even be inappropriate.
And the research confirms this. In a review of 17 studies on culturally adapted interventions, nearly all of them reported improvements in depression or anxiety symptoms when the treatments were systematically modified for cultural fit.
To make this a deep dive, let's go beyond just listing the 8 elements of the adaptation framework. Let's focus on 3 or 4 core areas where Western interventions typically fail and how deep adaptation corrects them. Let's start with concepts and metaphors.
Okay. So in Western therapeutic models, a core concept is often individual agency. The idea that you, the patient, have the power and the sole responsibility to change your thoughts and behaviors.
Right.
That concept can be foreign or even offensive to many collectivist cultures where well-being is intrinsically tied to the family, the community, or spiritual forces.
So a shallow adaptation just changes the name of the character in the manual.
A deep adaptation changes the concept itself. Instead of focusing only on I feel anxious, the intervention has to incorporate family dynamics or community obligation into the goal. And with metaphors, it's the same. A Western CBT metaphor might be about thought traps or a black dog for depression. These metaphors are meaningless if they're not culturally relevant. Deep adaptation might substitute those for local idioms or spiritual narratives that resonate deeply with how that community understands mental illness.
And that immediately impacts the goals of the intervention.
Yeah.
If the concept of well-being is collective, not individual, The ultimate goal of the therapy itself has to change.
It has to. If the standard Western goal is return to individual functional independence and emotional optimization, a culturally adapted goal might be restoration of harmony within the family unit, or reestablishing a positive connection with community elders. One study with American Indian youth, for example, successfully adapted an intervention by moving the focus away from purely clinical mental health goals to goals that were centered on cultural identity and connection to tradition, which they saw as prerequisites for internal stability.
And finally, let's talk about persons who delivers the intervention and who participates. This ties directly back to that erosion of family sovereignty we discussed earlier.
The person's element is vital. Western models often favor delivery by certified, non-community professionals. It's very top-down. If you try to impose that model in a culture where trust is paramount and authority rests with elders, the intervention will fail.
It'll be rejected.
It will. Successful deep adaptation often requires a profound shift in who is even considered a valid therapist or expert. This might mean engaging parents, community leaders, elders, spiritual leaders, not just as facilitators, but as co-creators of the intervention.
Their involvement is critical.
It's critical for increasing awareness and, crucially, for acceptance of mental health issues within the community. It ensures the intervention isn't seen as some external imposition, but as a community resource. And this shift requires ceding some power back to those localized authorities.
This all sounds like a constant negotiation. You're trying to retain fidelity to the essential principles of the evidence-based therapy, what researchers call the etic, while adapting to the cultural specific norms, the emic.
That tension is the central challenge of global mental health. You have to maintain the integrity of the core mechanism that makes the treatment effective, like the link between thoughts and feelings in CBT. But you have to apply it with flexibility that's tailored to the uniqueness of the client's world. This is a field that desperately needs more research to isolate which parts of a therapy are truly universal, the etic, and which must be culture-specific, the emic.
And there's also that intriguing research gap you mentioned, a comparative lack of focus on adapting interventions for minority communities within a Western country versus adapting interventions for a completely different non-Western nation.
That gap is highly significant. Adapting a manual for, say, a rural village in Asia is very different from adapting it for a long-established, marginalized minority within the borders of the UK or the US.
Why?
Because internal minority communities often face unique systemic factors, institutional discrimination, historical trauma, chronic economic instability that require bespoke adaptations that are different from those you'd need just crossing a geopolitical border. The need for culturally sensitive and contextually appropriate mental health interventions is universal, but the approach has to be hyper-localized to actually be effective. So if we synthesize our entire deep dive here, the core conflict is it's crystallized. The West's deep commitment to safety, to optimization, to standardization, the whole operating system of the therapeutic state, it has achieved control, but it has inadvertently fostered a culture of dependency, anxiety, and fragility. Christopher Lasch laid out the historical groundwork. He showed us how the family was transformed from a sovereign moral school into this hyper-regulated, high-risk industry. In our quest for guaranteed, expert-mediated safety, we surrendered our collective competence and our autonomy. And yet the global evidence, especially that paradox of Cameroon, forcefully suggests that true resilience and post-traumatic growth are often forged, paradoxically, through consistent friction and self-reliance, not through the removal of all perceived trauma. The capacity to adapt and grow is actually strengthened when environments demand constant problem-solving, a resource we're actively suppressing in the modern Western child.
And that takes us right back to the sandbox. We have stripped the family unit of its sacredness and replaced it with this suffocating bureaucracy, making the experience of raising children feel like a high-stakes government project that requires constant, terrified auditing. Parents are rightly terrified of making a technical error because the consequence isn't just a scolding. It's potential state intervention and the public shame of failing the optimization metric. The real irony we've uncovered is this. While globally we're learning that effective therapeutic intervention has to be radically localized and community-led ceding power back to elders and local concepts of wellness, we continue to apply a centralized, standardized, one-size-fits-all metric to the family unit right next door, ensuring the parent remains just a terrified middle manager. Thank you for engaging in this deep dive with us.